A door closed on Thrall Street, and no one made a note of the hour. It was late enough that the gas had gone thin in the lamps, and early enough that the market carts had not yet started to move. The woman who had closed it stood for a moment on the step, listening, though she could not have said for what. The air smelled of coal and wet brick and something older, the smell that Whitechapel had carried for as long as anyone alive could remember. A horse coughed somewhere on Commercial Street. A child cried, briefly, behind a window 2 doors down, and then did not cry again. She pulled her shawl across her chest and stepped into the road. 800 yards away, in a room she would never see, a man was finishing a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. He set it down without sound. He had no name yet, not the one history would give him. He had the name his mother had used, and the name on whatever paper he carried, and neither of those would ever be written in a courtroom or a confession. He was, for now, only a man with cold tea and steady hands. The woman on Thrall Street walked east, because east was where the lodging house was, and the lodging house took 4pence and asked nothing else. She passed 2 men arguing under a lamp, and a third already asleep against the wall beneath it. Her own footsteps made a sound she did not register. Footsteps in Whitechapel were the texture of the night itself. They had always been there, and so they were heard the way one hears one's own breathing, which is to say, not at all. This is the part that gets forgotten. Before the letters, before the name, before the broadsheets and the caricatures and the men in tall hats who came down from the West End to look at the streets where it had happened, before any of it, Whitechapel was already a place where women walked alone at 3 in the morning because they had nowhere else to be. The violence that would arrive in August had been arriving, in smaller forms, for decades. It would simply learn, that autumn, how to be remembered. The lodging housekeeper on Flower and Dean Street kept a ledger he never showed anyone. In it, in pencil, he had recorded the names of women who had not come back. Not all of them. Only the ones he had liked. The ledger went back to 1881. By the summer of 1888 it held 43 names, and he had stopped looking at it, because he had run out of room in the margin to mark the ones he was sure of. The woman from Thrall Street reached the corner of Osborne Street and stopped. She had heard something, or thought she had. A step, perhaps, behind her, the wrong kind of step, off the rhythm of her own. She turned her head, slowly, the way one turns when one does not want to admit that one is turning. The street behind her was empty. A cat moved along the gutter. The gas hissed in its lamp. She walked on. Somewhere, the man with the cold tea stood, and put on his coat, and stepped into a different street, and his footsteps joined the others, indistinguishable, for now, from the city itself. By 6 in the morning the carts had started, and the smell of the river had pushed inland on the tide. Whitechapel woke the way it always woke, without ceremony, without rest, with the sound of wheels on stone and the cough of men who had slept in their clothes. The woman from Thrall Street had reached her lodging house and paid her 4pence, and was asleep on a bench with her shawl over her face. She would wake at noon, and the day would proceed as days proceeded, and none of what she had heard in the street would be remembered by anyone, including her. This is what the histories do not say. The autumn of 1888 was not the beginning of violence in the East End. It was a moment in the middle of it, a moment that learned, by accident, how to make a sound the rest of England could hear. Charles Booth had begun his survey 2 years earlier. He was a shipping magnate from Liverpool with a quiet conviction that the numbers being printed about London's poor were wrong, too kind. He walked the streets with notebooks and a constable beside him, and he coloured each street on his map by the lives lived inside it. Black for the lowest class. Dark blue for the very poor. light blue for the chronically struggling. The map of Whitechapel, when he finished it, was nearly black. 76,000 people lived in a single square mile. They lived in rooms shared by 6, by 8, by 12. They lived in lodging houses where the bed was rented by the half night and the sheet was changed when someone complained. They lived above slaughter yards on Aldgate, and behind the brewery on Brick Lane, and in the courts off Dorset Street where the police walked only in pairs, and only when they had to. The Metropolitan Police Division that covered Whitechapel, H Division, had 575 officers for a population larger than most English cities. On any given night, perhaps 200 of them were on the streets. The rest were asleep, or filling out reports about the night before, or standing in courtrooms describing things they had not been there to see. Violence was the weather. A woman called Emma Smith had been attacked on the night of the 3rd of April, walking home from a pub on Whitechapel Road. She had been beaten, and something had been forced inside her, a stick, the doctors thought. She walked herself to the London hospital. She died there the next day, of peritonitis, having named no one. The inquest recorded the cause and closed the file. The newspapers gave it 4 lines. Footsteps in those streets were a kind of currency. You learned to read them: the drunk man's stagger, the constable's measured pace, the woman walking fast because she had somewhere to be, and the woman walking fast because she did not. You learned them the way a sailor learns weather. They told you whether to cross the road, or wait in a doorway, or pretend you had not heard. Most of the time, they told you nothing, and that was the texture of the night. The man with the cold tea had walked home before dawn. He had not been seen, because no one in Whitechapel was seen at that hour by anyone who would later be asked. He had passed a constable on the corner of Hanbury Street. The constable had nodded. The man had nodded back. Neither of them would remember it. On the 7th of August, 4 months after Emma Smith had been buried in a pauper's grave at the City of London Cemetery, a woman named Martha Tabram would be found on the first-floor landing of a tenement on George Yard. She had been stabbed 39 times. The papers, this time, would give her 6 lines. It was still summer. The autumn had not yet begun. Her name, on the night she died, was Polly. She had been Marian once, in the parish register, and Marian Nichols on the marriage certificate, and Polly to the women who shared the lodging house on Thrall Street and to the men who bought her drinks on the strength of a face that had been pretty 15 years ago. She was 43. She was 5 feet 2. She had 5 teeth missing, and a small scar on her forehead, and a bonnet she had bought that afternoon and could not stop showing people. The bonnet was new. She had told the lodging house keeper, when he turned her away at 1:30 in the morning for being 4pence short, not to worry. "See what a jolly bonnet I've got," she had said. "I'll soon get my DOS money." She had walked out into Osborne Street still saying it, half to him and half to herself, the way people speak when they are trying to convince the night of something. It was 36 hours since she had slept indoors. She had drunk gin at the Frying Pan public house on the corner of Brick Lane, and she had walked east along Whitechapel Road, and she had been seen at 2:30 by a woman she knew called Emily Holland, on the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road, and she had told Emily she had earned her DOS money 3 times over that night and spent it 3 times over too. Emily Holland had tried to convince her to come back to the lodging house on Thrall Street. Polly had laughed and walked on, east, toward Bucks Row. Bucks Row was a narrow street that ran along the back of a board school and a row of stables. It had a gas lamp at the western end, near the corner with Brady Street, and another at the eastern end, near the Whitechapel Underground Works. Between them, for perhaps 150 yards, the street was dark. The houses on the north side had their bedroom windows facing the road. Most of them were occupied. 3 of those windows would later be opened, the morning after, and the women behind them would say they had heard nothing. They had heard nothing because there had been nothing to hear. Somewhere between 3 and 3:40 in the morning, on a stretch of pavement outside a stable gate, the man with the cold tea stepped out of the dark, and Polly Nichols stopped walking. There is no record of what was said. There is no record of whether anything was said. There is only the gate, and the pavement, and the gas lamp 40 yards away that did not reach. Charles Cross was a carman. He worked at Pickford's, and he left his house on Doveton Street at 3:20 to walk to work, because his shift began at 4 and he was the kind of man who arrived early. He turned into Bucks Row from the East End. He saw, on the opposite pavement, what he thought at first was a tarpaulin. He crossed to look. It was a woman. Her skirts were pushed up to her waist, and her bonnet, the new bonnet, had fallen beside her head. Cross stood for a moment, uncertain. He heard another set of footsteps approaching from the same direction he had come. Another carman, Robert Paul, on his way to work at Corbett's Court. Cross called out to him, "Come and look at this woman." The 2 of them bent down. Paul thought he felt a faint warmth in her hand. Cross thought he saw her chest move, once. They could not be sure. They were already late. They went to find a policeman. They walked together to the corner of Hanbury Street, and they found Constable Mizzen, and they told him what they had seen, and they continued to work. Neither of them had seen her throat. The light had not reached. Constable John Neal, walking his beat west along Bucks Row, found her 4 minutes later. His lantern lit her face first, and then her neck, and then the rest. He did not call out. He signalled, with his lamp, to Constable Tyne on the next beat. The blood, he would say at the inquest, was still running. 3:45 in the morning, on the 31st of August, 1888. The autumn had begun. Dr. Rhys Llewellyn arrived at 4 o'clock. He lived at 152 Whitechapel Road, and the constable had run for him on foot, and the run had taken 11 minutes. He knelt beside her on the pavement and turned her head gently, the way one turns the head of someone who is only sleeping, and he saw what the lantern had shown Constable Neal. He pronounced her dead. He said it had been done within the last half hour. He said the body was still warm, and he was correct, and he did not yet know what else had been done, because the skirts had not yet been moved. They carried her to the mortuary at Old Montague Street on a hand ambulance, a covered cart with 2 wheels. By the time she arrived, 3 women from the workhouse had been instructed to wash her and prepare her for the inquest. They were halfway through removing her clothing when Inspector John Spraitling arrived and saw, for the first time, what had been done to her abdomen. He told the women to stop. They had already washed most of the blood away. This was the first investigation. It was not, by the standards of 1888, badly handled. It was handled the way investigations in Whitechapel were always handled, by men who were tired, who had other cases, who had not been trained for what they were looking at, and who assumed, because every previous case had taught them to assume it, that this would be like every previous case. It would not be. The news reached Fleet Street by mid-morning. The Star, an evening paper less than a year old, sent a reporter east before noon. He walked Bucks Row. He spoke to the women in the houses with the open windows. He spoke to the keeper of the stable. He spoke to a man on Brady Street who had heard a woman's voice cry murder twice during the night, and who had decided it was nothing, because women's voices cried murder in Whitechapel often enough that one had learned not to rise from bed for it. The reporter wrote this down. He underlined it twice. By 6 in the evening, the Star was on the street with a headline that took up half the front page. A Whitechapel horror. By 8, the second edition had sold out. By the morning of the 1st of September, every paper in London was running the story, and most of them were running it on page 1. The pattern that would define the autumn, the pattern that no one yet recognized as a pattern, had just produced its first headline. And so the city began to listen differently. Before we continue, wherever you are listening from tonight, I find myself wondering what hour it is for you. Whether the light is still in the room, or whether it has already gone. Whether the street outside your window is the kind that goes quiet after dark, or the kind that doesn't. If you have a moment, leave it in the comments. Where you are. What time it is. It belongs in the archive too. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee did not yet exist. It would form 3 weeks later, after the second death, in a room above the Crown Public House on Mile End Road, organised by a local builder named George Lusk, who would, in October, receive a small cardboard box in the post containing half of a human kidney and a letter signed from hell. That was still a month away. On the morning of the 31st of August, the committee was only an idea in the mind of a man who did not yet know he would have it. The women of Whitechapel learned of Polly Nichols's death the way women in Whitechapel learned of most things, from each other, in doorways, while waiting for something. Emily Holland, who had spoken to her at 2:30 on Osborne Street, heard by 10 in the morning. She sat down on the step of the lodging house on Thrall Street, and she did not rise from it for an hour. She had told her to come back. She had told her. The man with the cold tea had slept. He had washed, and he had hung his coat to dry in a room that had a window facing a yard, and he had gone out, sometime in the late morning, into the same streets the police were now walking. He had passed 2 constables. Neither of them had looked at him twice. He was, by every visible measure, a man on his way somewhere. In a small office on the Strand, at the Central News Agency, a sub-editor was sorting the morning's post. A letter would arrive, in 26 days, addressed to him personally, written in red ink, that would change the name of the autumn. It had not yet been written. The hand that would write it had not yet picked up the pen. But somewhere, in a room with a window facing a yard, the paper had already been bought. And in Whitechapel, the footsteps continued. They had always continued. The difference, beginning that morning, was that some of them were being listened to. 8 days passed, and Whitechapel did what Whitechapel did. The papers cooled. The reporters returned to other stories. The inquest into Polly Nichols opened at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road and was adjourned twice, and the coroner, a man named Wynne Baxter, who wore a white waistcoat to court because he believed it conveyed seriousness, questioned witnesses with a slow precision that the Star described as almost theatrical. He had no suspect. He had no theory. He had a body that had been washed before it could be examined, and 3 constables who had seen nothing, and a carman who had thought, briefly, that it was a tarpaulin. Annie Chapman was 47. She had been called Dark Annie by the women on Dorset Street, because her hair was nearly black, and she was small, 5 feet exactly, and she was sick. She had a chest condition that made her cough through the night, and she had spent most of the last week trying to sell crochet work and matchboxes for the price of a bed. On the evening of the 7th of September she had a row with another woman, Eliza Cooper, at the Britannia Public House on the corner of Dorset Street. The row was about a piece of soap. Annie left with a bruise on her right temple and another forming under her eye. By 1:30 in the morning she was at Crossingham's lodging house on Dorset Street, asking the deputy if she might come in. She had no money. She had been drinking, but not enough to be unsteady. A witness would later say she was tired more than drunk. The deputy turned her away. She said, on the step, what women in Whitechapel often said on lodging house steps at 1:30 in the morning. Don't let the bed. I'll be back soon. I'll have the money. She walked out, east, towards Spitalfields Market and the streets behind it. She walked, the witnesses said, slowly. Number 29 Hanbury Street was a 3-story lodging house occupied by 17 people. It had a front door that opened onto the street and a back door that opened onto a small yard, perhaps 15 feet by 13, fenced on one side and bordered on the other by the wall of number 27. There was a privy in the corner, and a set of stone steps down to the yard from the back door, and a wooden fence between the yard and the cellar entrance. The back door was never locked. None of the 17 residents could remember it ever having been locked. Anyone in the street could push through to the yard, and frequently did, and the residents had stopped noticing. At 5:45 in the morning, a carman called John Davis came down from his room on the 3rd floor, opened the back door, and saw, on the ground between the steps and the fence, what at first he could not assemble into a shape. The light was thin. The yard was in shadow. He saw a foot. He saw the hem of a skirt pulled up. He saw, then, more than he had time to understand. He turned and ran into the street without his jacket, and he found 2 men loading packing cases for the market, and he said only, come and see this. The 3 of them stood at the top of the steps. None of them descended. One of them, a man named James Kent, would say later that he could not move because his legs had gone heavy, and that he had stood there long enough for the church bell at Christ Church, Spitalfields to strike 6, and that the sound of it had freed him. He ran for a constable. By the time Inspector Joseph Chandler arrived, at 6:10, perhaps 30 people were in Hanbury Street, and word had reached 2 more streets, and a small boy on Brick Lane was already running toward Commercial Street shouting that there had been another one. Another one. The phrase had not existed 9 days ago. It did now. Inspector Chandler cleared the yard. He sent for Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the H Division police surgeon, and he stood at the top of the steps and looked down at Annie Chapman, and he did not, for some minutes, write anything in his notebook. What was on the ground in front of him was not what had been done to Polly Nichols. It was more than that. It was, by his own later testimony, the work of someone who had taken his time, and who had known, in some functional sense, what he was doing. The yard was perhaps 6 yards from the back door of the house, and perhaps 15 yards from the front door, and perhaps 30 yards from the nearest occupied bedroom window. None of the 17 people in the house had heard anything. One of them, a cabman named Albert Kadosh in the yard of number 27, had heard, at about 5:30, the sound of someone saying no once, in a low voice, and a moment later the sound of something falling lightly against the fence. He had thought nothing of it. He had gone back inside. Dr. Phillips arrived at 6:30. He examined her where she lay, and he wrote, in a careful hand, what he could record without moving the body. He noted the temperature of the skin, the rigor, the position of the limbs. He noted what had been done to the throat and what had been done to the abdomen. He did not, in his notes, name the organs that had been removed. He would name them at the inquest, 2 weeks later, and the Star would print them on the front page, and the women of Whitechapel would read them, or hear them read aloud, and the autumn would shift. The man with the cold tea had walked home in daylight. It had been raining slightly. The streets had been waking. He had passed a milk cart and a woman on her knees scrubbing a doorstep. He had not run. He had not hurried. He had walked at the pace of a man with somewhere ordinary to be, and the city, which had begun, 8 days earlier, to listen differently, had not yet learned what to listen for. By the evening of the 8th of September, the inquest had not yet opened, the post-mortem had not yet been read aloud, and already 3 women on Dorset Street had decided not to walk alone. It was not a meeting. There was no agreement. It was the way news travelled through Whitechapel, not in headlines but in adjustments, small and immediate, made by people who had survived by adjusting. One woman did not go to her usual corner. Another waited for a friend at the door of the Britannia, and they walked together. A third borrowed a kitchen knife from the lodging-house keeper and put it in the pocket of her apron, and the keeper did not ask her to return it. The Star ran the post-mortem details on the 11th. What had been removed from Annie Chapman was named, in print, in a column inches long. The women who could read it. The women who could not had it read to them, in pairs, in doorways, in the back rooms of pubs where the gas was low. The reading did not always finish. One witness, a flower seller called Maud, would later tell a reporter that the woman reading to her had stopped at a certain sentence and folded the paper and said only, "That's enough of that, then." They had sat for a while without speaking. The Metropolitan Police, in the same week, wrote to the Commissioner of Works requesting additional gas lamps for the streets between Commercial Road and Whitechapel High Street. The request was filed. It would be partially granted in November. By then, 4 more women would be dead. What changed in Whitechapel that September was not visible from outside? The streets looked the same. The carts still came at 4. The market still opened at 5. The pubs still emptied at 12:30. But inside the streets, inside the way a woman crossed a road, inside the half-second pause before she turned a corner, inside the decision to take the long way home because the short way past an unlit yard, something had reorganized. The city had not learned anything new. It had only begun to apply, more carefully, what it had always known. And it had begun to listen. The footsteps that had been the texture of the night, that had been heard the way one hears one's own breathing, were now being heard the way a sailor hears the rigging in a wind that has not yet arrived. A woman walking east along Hanbury Street at midnight could now tell you, without thinking about it, whether the steps behind her were a constable's or a drunkard's, whether they were closing on her or holding their distance, whether they had paused when she paused or continued at the same pace. She could tell you because she had begun, without deciding to begin, to count them. She did not always know she was counting. She knew only that some nights she reached her door before she meant to, and stood with her hand on the latch, and listened for a moment longer than was reasonable, before going in. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee held its first meeting on the 10th of September in a room above the Crown Public House on Mile End Road. 16 men attended. They were tradesmen and small shopkeepers and 1 retired soldier. They agreed to fund, from their own pockets, a patrol of unpaid volunteers who would walk the streets between midnight and 4 in the morning, in pairs, with whistles. The whistles were the same pattern as those issued to the Metropolitan Police. The patrols began the following night. They would continue, with varying numbers, until the end of November. The man with the cold tea had not been out for 3 nights. He had stayed in the room with the window facing the yard, and he had read the papers, and he had folded them and put them away. He had been observed, on the morning of the 10th, buying bread at a baker's on Commercial Road. The baker would not remember him. No one would remember him. He had done nothing memorable. He had bought bread. He had paid. He had nodded. He had gone. On the night of the 12th of September, a woman walking home along Berner Street heard footsteps behind her and turned, and saw a constable, and felt, for the first time in her life, relieved at the sight. She did not know that in 18 days she would be dead on the same street, and that the man who would kill her was, that night, 3 streets away, eating supper. The envelope arrived at the Central News Agency on the morning of the 27th of September. It was addressed in red ink, in a hand that sloped slightly forward, to the boss, Central News Office, London City. The sub-editor who opened it, a man named Thomas Bulling, who would later in his career become something close to famous, though never quite for the right reasons, read it twice before he passed it down the desk. He did not, at first, take it seriously. The agency received perhaps a dozen letters a week about the Whitechapel murders by then. Most were from cranks. Some were from confessors who had not done it. A few were from men who wished they had. This one was different in a way Bulling could not immediately name. It was written in red ink that the writer claimed was blood and that the laboratory would later determine was not. It was dated the 25th, 2 days earlier. It opened with a line that, by the end of the autumn, would be quoted in every newspaper in England, and that, when read aloud in a courtroom or a kitchen or a vigilance committee meeting room, would always produce the same small pause, the same shift in the room. Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. The letter ran to 2 pages. It boasted. It taunted. It used a phrase, funny little games, that would attach itself to the autumn the way certain phrases do, by sounding both childish and wrong. It promised, in the next job, to clip the lady's ears off. And it signed itself, at the bottom, with a name that had not existed in English before that morning. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. The trade name. As though killing were a profession. As though the killer wished, by naming himself, to be known the way a chimney sweep was known, or a coal merchant, or a music hall comedian whose card appeared in the Era. Bulling forwarded the letter to Scotland Yard on the 29th. The Central News Agency did not, at first, publish it. The decision to publish was made by Charles Warren himself, the Commissioner of Police, who authorized facsimile reproduction in the hope that someone, a landlady, a clerk, a wife, would recognize the handwriting. The facsimiles appeared on the 1st of October. They appeared on the same morning that the city was reading about what had happened in the early hours of the day before, on Berner Street and at Mitre Square. The timing made the letter true. If it had arrived a week earlier, it would have been a crank. If it had arrived a week later, it would have been a postscript. Arriving when it did, 3 days before the double event, 2 days before the city woke to find that the killer had not been caught and was not, evidently, going to be, it acquired a coincidence that no reader of the autumn could ignore. The Ripper had announced himself, and within 72 hours had appeared to keep his word. It did not matter, in the end, whether he had written it. By the 1st of October, the name was in every paper, on every street corner, in every conversation that had previously used the phrase the Whitechapel murderer. The man with the cold tea now had a name, and the name had not come from him. It had come from a sub-editor at a news agency on the Strand, who had received a letter in red ink, and had not, at first, believed it. And the name, once given, would outlive every man who carried it, and every theory that tried to attach it to a face, and every century since. Jack the Ripper. The trade name. Don't mind me giving it. In Whitechapel, on the night the facsimiles went up in the shop windows, a woman walking home along Hanbury Street stopped to read one. She read it slowly. She read it twice. She folded her shawl tighter at her throat, though it was not cold, and she walked on. Her footsteps, on the wet stone, made a sound she could now name. She did not yet know that the name was the wrong one. She knew only that, for the first time, the thing in the city had agreed to be called something. And what is named, the women of Whitechapel had always understood, can sometimes be kept away. Elizabeth Stride was 44 and Swedish. She had come to London 19 years earlier from a parish outside Gothenburg, and she had married a carpenter named John Stride who had run a coffee room in Poplar until it failed, and she had told people, after he died, that he had drowned with their children in the Princess Alice disaster on the Thames. It was not true. He had died of heart disease in a workhouse in Bromley, and there had been no children. But she had told the story so many times that it had become, in her, the kind of thing that is no longer quite a lie. She had needed a grief the world could see. She had given herself one. On the evening of the 29th of September she was at the Bricklayers Arms on Settle Street, drinking with a man whose face 2 witnesses would describe and no one would identify. She left around 11. She was seen at 11:30 walking east toward Berner Street alone. She was seen at 11:45 standing in a doorway on Berner Street with a man, and at 12:05 again, and at 12:35 with what may have been a different man, or the same man seen differently. The witnesses contradicted each other on his coat. They agreed only that he was not tall. Number 40 Berner Street housed the International Working Men's Educational Club, a socialist meeting hall used mostly by Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. That night a debate on the necessity of socialism among Jews had run late, and singing had begun, and through the open windows the singing carried down into Dutfield's yard, a narrow passage between the club and the workshops next door, gated by 2 wooden doors that no one ever closed. At 1 o'clock the steward, a man named Louis Diemschutz, turned his pony cart into the yard to unload the costume jewelry he sold at markets. The pony shied. It would not enter. Diemschutz climbed down. He struck a match. He saw, against the wall of the club, a shape he could not at first interpret, and he stepped over it twice before he understood that it was a woman, and that she was bleeding, and that the bleeding was recent enough that it had not yet stopped. He ran inside. The singing stopped. Within a minute the yard contained 8 people. Within 5 it contained 20. Within 15 the police had arrived, and the yard had been closed, and Elizabeth Stride had been confirmed dead from a single cut to the throat. A single cut. Nothing else had been done to her. It was the absence of what had been done, not the presence of it, that told Inspector Edmund Reed, when he arrived at 1:20, what had happened. The killer had been interrupted. He had heard the pony cart turning in from Berner Street. He had stepped past Diemschutz in the dark, or behind him, or through the gate before the gate was reached. He had not finished, and he had not waited, and he was, by the time the singing stopped inside the club, already walking west. He had 35 minutes. He used them. Mitre Square was 3/4 of a mile away, on the eastern edge of the City of London, which meant a different police force. The City of London Police, not the Metropolitan, patrolled it. It was a small cobbled square with 3 entrances and a single gas lamp at its centre, and 3 of its 4 sides were occupied by warehouses that were locked and unlit at that hour. The 4th side was occupied by 2 empty houses and the back of a shop. Constable Edward Watkins walked his beat through Mitre Square at 1:30. The square was empty. He walked it again at 1:44. The square was not empty. Catherine Eddowes was 46. She had been arrested earlier that night for public drunkenness on Aldgate High Street, and held at Bishopsgate Police Station until she had sobered, and released at 1 o'clock with the words, recorded in the station book, "I'll get a damn fine hiding when I get home." She had walked east, toward Whitechapel, toward Mitre Square. She had been released 7 minutes before Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard. The man with the cold tea, walking west from Berner Street, would have crossed her path somewhere near Houndsditch. There is no witness who saw it. What Constable Watkins found in Mitre Square at 1:44 was the work the killer had not been able to finish in Berner Street. He had finished it here. Watkins ran for the night watchman at Curley and Tong's warehouse on the corner, a former Metropolitan Constable named George Morris, and Morris ran for help, and within minutes the City of London Police had sealed the square. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown was sent for. He arrived at 2:18. He noted, in the field, what had been done. He did not, in the field, write it all down. By dawn the city had its phrase for the night. The double event. 2 women in 45 minutes. 1 unfinished, 1 finished. The killer had walked between them through a city that was, by the autumn of 1888, supposedly listening. It had not heard him. It had not heard him at all. At 2:55 in the morning, Constable Alfred Long of the Metropolitan Police walked his beat down Goulston Street and saw, in the entrance to the stairwell of number 108, a piece of cloth on the floor. He picked it up. It was wet and dark with what he believed correctly to be blood, and it was a fragment of an apron, cut, not torn, from a larger piece. He held it under his lantern. Above it, on the brickwork inside the stairwell, in white chalk in a slanting schoolroom hand, someone had written a sentence. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Long copied the sentence into his notebook. He copied it carefully, because he had been trained to copy carefully, and he noted the spelling, including the unusual capital letters and the misspelt word Jews, and he sent for his inspector. The fragment of apron, when matched later that morning at the mortuary on Golden Lane, would prove to be from the apron worn by Catherine Eddowes, cut from her body in Mitre Square and dropped here, 1/3 of a mile away, by the man who had cut it. He had walked from Mitre Square through Houndsditch and into Goulston Street with the piece of blooded cloth in his hand. He had stopped, at some point, in a stairwell, and he had wiped his hands or his knife on it, and he had let it fall. Above it, on a wall that any literate person passing could read, he had written, or someone had written, 18 words. By 5 in the morning 2 senior officers were standing in the stairwell. Superintendent Thomas Arnold of H Division had been summoned from his bed. Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of Police, arrived from Scotland Yard before dawn. They stood beneath the chalk sentence with their lanterns raised, and they conferred. Goulston Street was in the Spitalfields district, on the edge of a heavily Jewish neighbourhood. The wall belonged to a tenement called the Wentworth Model Dwellings, occupied almost entirely by Jewish families. In 4 hours the streets would be full. The market on Petticoat Lane would open. The sentence above the apron would be read by every person who passed through that stairwell, and the city, which had spent the autumn looking for a reason, would be given one. The City of London Police, who had jurisdiction over Mitre Square, wanted the sentence photographed before it was removed. They had sent for a photographer. He was on his way. They asked Warren to wait. Warren refused. He gave the order, at 5:30 in the morning, that the sentence be sponged from the wall before the sun came up. Superintendent Arnold offered a compromise, to wash off only the top line, the word Jews, and leave the rest until the photograph was taken. Warren refused that also. He ordered the entire sentence erased. A constable was sent for a wet sponge. He returned. He climbed onto a chair brought from a neighbouring flat. He wiped the chalk from the brick. The Commissioner of Police watched him do it. The city detectives watched also, and one of them, Detective Constable Daniel Halse, would write in his report later that day that he had protested and had been overruled, and that he had walked away from the stairwell knowing that a piece of evidence had been destroyed by the man whose job it was to preserve it. The wall was clean by 6. The market opened at 7. No one passing through the stairwell that morning saw anything except a wet patch on the brick. The decision has been argued about for 138 years. Warren defended it for the rest of his life, a defense he was eventually asked to deliver in person to the Home Secretary. He had been afraid, he said, of an anti-Jewish riot. The autumn had already produced violent rumors about Jewish butchers and Jewish leatherworkers, and the phrase "the Jews are the men," left up for a market crowd to read, would, he believed, have set the East End on fire. It was not, on its face, an unreasonable fear. It was also the moment, more than any other in the autumn, when the investigation began to lose to the city. What the writing said, no one now knows. Whether the killer had written it, or whether he had passed beneath words already there, or whether the words referred to anything at all beyond a complaint chalked by an angry tenant the day before, all of this was lost with the sponge. The only person who had read it carefully was Constable Long, whose notebook gave one version, and Detective Halse, whose notebook gave another that differed in the spelling and in the placement of the line breaks. 2 notebooks. 18 words. A wall that had been clean by sunrise. The man with the cold tea was, by then, asleep. He had walked home along Middlesex Street and turned into the streets beyond, and he had washed at a basin, and he had gone to bed in a room with a window facing a yard. The city he had walked through that night was, somewhere in its records, beginning to lose him. The footsteps in Whitechapel that morning were the footsteps of police, of journalists, of women walking home in pairs after sitting up all night with the news. They were not, for the first time in the autumn, the footsteps anyone was listening for. The thing the city had learned to hear had moved past hearing. It had become, in the space of one night and one wall and one wet sponge, something the city could no longer be sure it had been hearing at all. October began with rain. It rained on the 1st, lightly, while the facsimiles of the Dear Boss letter were being pasted into the windows of stationers and tobacconists from Aldgate to Limehouse. It rained on the 2nd, harder, while Charles Warren wrote to the Home Secretary explaining the wet sponge. It rained on the 3rd and the 4th, and the women of Whitechapel walked to the lodging houses with their shawls pulled over their heads, and the constables on the new patrols stood under awnings and counted the hours until dawn. And nothing happened. Or rather, many things happened, but the thing the city was waiting for did not. This is the strange wait of October 1888. It is the part of the autumn that the books skip past, because nothing in it can be told as event. There were no bodies. There were no witnesses. There were no inquests opening that month other than those still concluding the inquests of September. What there was, instead, was waiting. And waiting, when it goes on long enough, becomes its own kind of presence. The papers, deprived of new horror, invented suspects. A Polish bootmaker named John Pizer, already cleared by the police in early September, was named again in 3 different broadsheets under 3 different versions of his nickname, Leather Apron. He had to be moved to a safe address. A doctor on Harley Street received hate mail for 2 weeks because his name had appeared, in a single sentence in a single column, beside a speculation about surgical knowledge. An American quack named Francis Tumblety was arrested on an unrelated charge and quietly placed on the list of men the police were watching, and then quietly removed when he posted bail and sailed for France. None of this reached the public. The public was reading about a Russian agent, and a Jewish ritual slaughter, and a man in a tall hat who had been seen, the papers said, in 7 places at once. On the 16th of October, George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee opened a small cardboard parcel that had arrived at his house in Mile End. It contained half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits of wine, and a letter signed from hell. The letter was short. The handwriting was nothing like the Dear Boss letter. It claimed the kidney came from the woman in Mitre Square, and that the other half had been fried and eaten. Dr. Thomas Openshaw at the London hospital examined the kidney and reported, cautiously, that it was consistent in size and condition with a kidney removed from a recently deceased adult, and that it showed signs of Bright's disease, which Catherine Eddowes had suffered from. He would not, and could not, say more. Lusk reported the parcel to the police and then, by the next morning, to the papers. The city read about it over breakfast. The kidney passed, in a single news cycle, from evidence to artifact to rumour. By the end of October, no one outside Scotland Yard could say with certainty whether the kidney had been Eddowes's, or whether it had come from a dissection room theft at a London medical school, an old and well-worn student prank, which several doctors privately believed it to be. The uncertainty did not matter. The half-kidney had done its work. It had kept the autumn awake. And the city was awake. That is the thing the histories do not quite manage to record. Whitechapel in October was not in mourning, and not in panic, and not in any of the conditions newspapers were equipped to describe. It was awake. It was sitting up at 3 in the morning with a candle still lit. It was hearing every cart, every dog, every cough on the floor above. It was a woman counting her own footsteps as she crossed Dorset Street because she had nothing else to count. If you have walked with us this far, through August, through Bucks Row, through Hanbury Street, through the Double Event and the Wet Sponge, I am glad of it. There is no rush to this. The archive moves at the pace it moves. If something in these streets has stayed with you, the small things help. A like, where you are listening. A subscription, if you would like the next one to find you. A comment, if you have somewhere you want to leave a thought. They are quiet gestures, and they keep this kind of telling possible. And the candle, still lit at 3 in the morning, stays lit. The woman in the room above hers does not blow it out. Neither does she. The patrols continued. They walked in pairs, with whistles. They walked Hanbury Street and Berner Street and Dorset Street and the lanes between. They walked past Miller's Court without looking down it, because there was no reason to look down it. Miller's Court was a small dead end off Dorset Street where 6 rooms had been carved out of the back of a larger house, and the woman who lived in number 13, the only ground floor room with its own door, paid 4 shillings and sixpence a week and was, that October, 25 years old. Her name was Mary Jane Kelly. She had a window facing the court. She had a key she had lost in September and never replaced. She was, on the night of the 31st of October, still alive. The man with the cold tea had not killed in 5 weeks. He had walked the streets in October the way other men walked them, to the baker, to the public house, to the corner where the omnibus stopped. He had been seen many times. He had not been remembered once. He had read the Dear Boss facsimile in a shop window on Commercial Road, and he had stood before it for a long moment, and then he had walked on. What he had thought of the name no one ever asked, because no one ever found him to ask. The footsteps in Whitechapel that October were the footsteps of people not yet harmed. The city listened to them anyway. The listening had outlived the cause. It was, by the end of the month, the condition of the place itself. On the morning of the 1st of November, the rain stopped. The streets dried in the wind. The papers ran small notices about the failure of the police investigation, and the resignation, rumoured but not yet confirmed, of Sir Charles Warren. The women of Dorset Street walked to market in the thin sun, and one of them passed Mary Jane Kelly on the corner of Crispin Street, and they nodded to each other, and they walked on. There were 8 days left. She had been born, she told people, in Limerick, and brought as a child to Wales when her father took work at an ironworks in Carmarthenshire. She had married a collier at 16, and the collier had died in a pit explosion within 2 years, and she had gone to live with a cousin in Cardiff, and from Cardiff to a house in the West End of London, and from the West End to France for a few months with a man she did not name, and from France back to London, and from London by degrees east, through Ratcliffe, through Stepney, through Whitechapel, to a single ground floor room at the end of a passage off Dorset Street. Most of this was true. Some of it was not. The parts she told differently to different people were the parts she had needed differently, and by November of 1888 there was no one left who could have said which was which. She was 25 years old. She was, by the testimony of everyone who knew her, beautiful, not in the careful 19th century sense of the word, which usually meant pale and small, but in the sense that men remembered her after one meeting and women turned to watch her walk past. She was tall for the East End, 5'7", with long fair hair she usually wore loose. She drank, when she had money, and when she drank she sang. The song she sang most often was an Irish ballad called A Violet from Mother's Grave, which her neighbours in Miller's Court had heard so many times they no longer noticed it. They would notice it, in 8 days. They would remember it for the rest of their lives. Miller's Court was reached by a passage 3 feet wide, on the south side of Dorset Street, between a chandler's shop and a public house called the Britannia. The passage was perhaps 20 feet long and dark at any hour. It opened into a small courtyard with a gas lamp at the centre and 6 doors leading off it, 5 upstairs flats reached by an exterior staircase, and 1 ground floor room with a door of its own. The door of room 13 had a window beside it, with 2 panes of glass. One of the panes had been broken in a quarrel some weeks earlier, and the broken pane was covered, on the inside, with a piece of muslin tacked at the corners. The arrangement was visible from outside only as a dim greyness where a window should have been. Anyone passing through the court could have placed a hand through the broken pane, reached around the muslin, and unhooked the latch on the door. She had lost the key in September. She had told Joseph Barnett, the man she had lived with from April until the last week of October, that she did not need a new one, because they could let themselves in through the window. Joseph Barnett had moved out on the 30th of October after a quarrel about a woman she had let sleep in the room one night out of charity. He had not gone far. He had taken a bed at a lodging house on New Street, 10 minutes' walk away, and he had visited her 3 times in the following week, and they had parted on terms that were neither bitter nor settled. On the evening of the 8th of November he visited her again, between 7:30 and 8. He stayed for perhaps half an hour. He gave her a small sum of money, he could not afterwards remember whether it was a shilling or 18 pence, and he left. She was alive when he left. She was sober. She had not yet sung that night. The man with the cold tea was, that evening, at supper. He had eaten in a public house, not the Britannia, which was too near the court, but one on Commercial Road, where the lighting was poor and the company anonymous. He had read a newspaper while he ate. The paper contained, on page 4, a small notice about the Lord Mayor's show to be held the following morning, and a paragraph about the resignation of Sir Charles Warren, which had been confirmed that day. He had finished his meal slowly. He had paid. He had stepped out into Commercial Road, where the gas lamps were beginning to come on, and he had turned east. The footsteps in Miller's Court that night were the footsteps of a woman who had been left her own door. She came home around 11:30, slightly drunk, with a man whose face would later be described by a neighbour, a woman named Marion Cox who lived in number 5, as having a blotchy complexion and a thick carroty moustache. He carried a quart pot of ale. They went inside. The door closed. A few minutes later, through the muslin-covered window, Marion Cox heard the sound of singing. It was a violet from Mother's grave. The voice was Mary Jane Kelly's. It continued, on and off, for perhaps an hour. After that, there was silence in the court, and rain began to fall, and the gas lamp at its center hissed in the wet, and the night went on the way nights in November went on. The singing had stopped by 1. No one in Miller's Court would later be able to say with certainty when, or why. She was still alive. The rain was steady. The lamp burned. Somewhere in the city, a man with cold tea finished his walk and reached his door and unlocked it and went inside, and washed his hands, and read for a while, and slept. He would not sleep for long. It is easy to forget, looking back, that London in the autumn of 1888 continued. The histories of the Whitechapel murders have a way of compressing the city into the murders, as though Berner Street and Mitre Square and Miller's Court were the only addresses that mattered that year, and the rest of the capital had paused, in some collective held breath, to watch. It had not. It had gone on. And the going on is part of what gives the autumn its weight, because the going on was where the killings happened, not in some isolated theatre of horror, but in a city of 4 million people that was, at every hour, doing 4 million other things. On the 8th of November, in the West End, a new play opened at the Lyceum Theatre. It was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, adapted from the Stevenson novella, with Richard Mansfield in the dual role. Mansfield had been performing it in New York earlier in the year, and the London run had begun in August. By November, his performance had become the subject of letters to the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette suggesting, half in earnest, that no man could portray such a transformation on stage unless he had, in some sense, experienced it. The Lyceum received an anonymous letter naming Mansfield as the Ripper. The police investigated, briefly, and let it drop. Mansfield himself, on the night of the 8th, gave the performance he always gave. The audience applauded. He went home to his hotel. He had no idea that, 6 miles east, a woman who had once seen the play advertised on a hoarding outside Aldgate station was singing to herself in a single ground-floor room. In the city, the Mansion House was being prepared for the Lord Mayor's banquet, scheduled for the following evening. The new Lord Mayor, James Whitehead, was a wool merchant from Lancashire, and the procession would pass through the streets of the city at midday on the 9th. A parade of guilds and aldermen and trade banners that had taken place every year for centuries, and that no autumn of murders, however terrible, would be permitted to interrupt. The Lord Mayor's show was a continuity older than the Ripper, and older than the Metropolitan Police, and older than the city's awareness of itself as a city that could be afraid. It would proceed. It always proceeded. In Hampstead, in a house overlooking the Heath, a young man named James Maybrick was writing a letter to his brother in Liverpool. The letter discussed business matters and family. It did not, as a forged document supposedly written by the same man would, 104 years later, claim, contain any reference to the East End or to murder. The autumn was full of men who would later be accused of being the Ripper, and many of them, that November, were doing nothing more remarkable than writing letters about business. The accusations would come decades after they were dead, when none of them could answer. The accusations would also, in time, be set aside, the way most accusations were set aside, into the long and dimly lit gallery of suspects that the autumn would generate for the next century and a half. In a slum 2 streets north of Mitre Square, a midwife named Mrs. Prater was sitting up with a woman in labour. The labour had begun at 6 in the evening. By 11 the woman was crying in a particular pattern that Mrs. Prater had heard 1,000 times, and the midwife had begun to time the contractions on a clock she had borrowed from the next-door neighbor. The baby would be born at 2 in the morning, a girl, healthy, the mother's fifth. Mrs. Prater would walk home through the rain at 3:30. She would pass the entrance to Miller's Court on her way. She would not look down it. There would have been nothing to see. In a quiet square off Bedford Place, a man named George Bernard Shaw was finishing an article for the Star. He had written it in a heat. It would appear in print on the 24th of September, 6 weeks earlier, and it argued that the murders had done what no royal commission and no parliamentary inquiry had managed to do, which was force the wealthy of London to acknowledge that a quarter-mile from their dining rooms there existed a quarter-mile of human suffering they had spent their lives not seeing. The Ripper, Shaw wrote, was a social reformer in his way. The article had been controversial. Shaw was £20 richer for it. By November he had moved on to other articles. The argument, however, had not gone away. It had taken root in a particular kind of literate London conscience, and would continue to take root, in different forms, for as long as the case was discussed. It is taking root, even now, in the way this is being told. And in Whitechapel, the rain that had begun at midnight kept falling. It fell on Miller's Court, on the cobbles of Dorset Street, on the wooden steps of the lodging houses where women sat up because they could not afford the bed and could not bring themselves to walk further. It fell on the constable patrolling Hanbury Street, who had stopped counting hours and begun, instead, counting the number of doorways he passed where the gas had been left burning all night. There were more than there used to be. The city had learned to keep small lights on. It did not yet know what it had learned them for. The man with the cold tea was already walking. He had not slept. He had washed his face in the basin and put on a coat that smelled faintly of damp, and he had stepped into a street where the rain had thinned to a fine mist. He moved east, the way he had moved east in August, and in September, and on the night of the double event. He moved at the pace of a man with somewhere to be. It was 3 in the morning. The footsteps in the city, that hour, were almost all his. Inspector Frederick Aberline had been a policeman for 25 years, 14 of them in Whitechapel, and he was, by the testimony of every officer who served under him, the man who knew the East End streets the way a parish priest knew a parish. He had walked them as a constable. He had stood in their pubs in plain clothes. He had been promoted out of H Division to Scotland Yard in 1887, and recalled to Whitechapel in September of 1888 precisely because no one else in the Metropolitan Police could read those streets as quickly as he could. By the second week of November he had been on the case for 10 weeks. He had interviewed, by the most conservative count in the files, more than 2,000 people. He had reviewed 300 individual suspects. He had not, in any of those interviews or any of those reviews, found the man. This is the part of the autumn that is most difficult to tell, because it is the part where nothing visible happens and where, beneath the surface of nothing visible, an institution is failing in slow motion. The Metropolitan Police in 1888 had been designed for a different kind of crime. It had been designed for theft and public disorder, and the occasional domestic murder where the killer was almost always the husband and almost always still in the house. It had no detective training in the modern sense, no central fingerprint system, no laboratory analysis of bloodstains, no method for cross-referencing the descriptions of suspects given by witnesses in different jurisdictions. It had men. It had patrols. It had notebooks. It had, in its most senior ranks, 2 officers, Robert Anderson and Donald Swanson, who were intelligent, methodical, and overwhelmed. Anderson had taken charge of the investigation on the 6th of October. He had been on holiday in Switzerland through most of September, and had returned to find the case sprawled across 3 divisions, 2 police forces, and several thousand sheets of paper. He had imposed order. He had assigned Donald Swanson as his coordinator, told him to read every file, and given him a desk and the authority to summon any officer he needed. Swanson did the work. He read everything. He compiled summaries. He produced, by the end of October, a chronological log of the case that historians would later describe as the most rigorous piece of administration any 19th-century police force had produced on any single inquiry. It was a magnificent document. It led nowhere. The suspects accumulated. There was Montague Drute, a barrister and schoolmaster who would drown himself in the Thames in early December, and whose family would tell the police, after his death, that they had thought him capable of the murders, a thought based on nothing they could put into words. There was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew from Whitechapel whose paranoid schizophrenia had begun to make him a danger to his sister, and who would be committed to Coney Hatch Asylum in 1891, and whom Anderson would name, in his memoirs decades later, as the man he believed had done it. There was Michael Ostrog, a Russian con man with a history of violent fraud, whom the Yard listed and watched and eventually cleared. There was Francis Tumblety, the American quack, who had jumped bail and crossed to France and from France to New York, and whom American detectives would attempt, without success, to extradite. There were dozens of others. There were hundreds of others, when one counted the letters of accusation from wives, mistresses, landladies, and rivals. The investigation was drowning in possibility. Aberline, in November, was working 16-hour days. He had begun to lose weight. His wife, in a single line in a letter to a sister, mentioned that he had stopped sleeping in their bed and was spending his nights in an armchair in the front room with case papers on his knees. He had begun to suspect, not a particular man, but a particular kind of man. He believed the killer was local, and that he lived within a quarter-mile of Whitechapel High Street, and that he was, in his daily life, unremarkable. He had told this to Swanson. Swanson had agreed. They had no way to find such a man. The methods that would, in another century, have made such a man findable, door-to-door canvassing on a scientific basis, forensic comparison of trace evidence, the cross-referencing of physical descriptions, did not yet exist. Whitechapel had 30,000 men of working age. The killer was one of them. He was, by Aberline's own correct intuition, walking the same streets the constables were walking. They simply could not see him. The man with the cold tea, that evening, was eating bread and cold meat at a table by a window. He could see, from where he sat, a constable on the opposite pavement, walking the southbound side of Commercial Street with a steady, measured pace. He had watched constables walk past his window perhaps 100 times that autumn. He had watched the same constable, very likely, walk past it many of those times. He did not recognize him. The constable did not look up. The footsteps of the Metropolitan Police in Whitechapel that autumn had become, by November, almost continuous. A woman standing on a corner could hear them in 3 directions. The patrols had been doubled, and doubled again. The Vigilance Committee walked in pairs through the night. The City of London Police, on the western edge of the district, had increased their own beats. And still, somewhere in the layered sound of all those footsteps, somewhere in the great organized pattern of a city trying to listen for him, his footsteps moved unheard. He had become, by the second week of November, the one set of steps in Whitechapel that the listening had stopped catching. The listening had grown too large to find anything specific in it. He walked through the noise of his own pursuit, and he was not heard. The Illustrated Police News on the 3rd of November carried, on its front page, a drawing that no witness had seen and no photograph had captured. It showed a man in a long dark coat and a tall silk hat, holding a Gladstone bag in one gloved hand and a knife in the other, standing under a gas lamp in a street that was not quite any street in Whitechapel but resembled all of them at once. His face was in shadow. His eyes were not. They had been drawn with particular care, and they looked, the editors believed, like the eyes of a man who could do the things the autumn had been doing. The drawing would be reprinted, in variations, in 7 other papers by the end of the week. By the middle of November, every literate person in London would have seen some version of it. The figure on the page would, in their minds, become the figure in the streets. None of it was true. All of it would last. This is what the press did in the autumn of 1888. It is not a moral failing of any individual editor, and it is not, in retrospect, surprising. The penny press in London had been competing for circulation since the 1850s, and by the late 1880s the competition had reached a particular fever. The Star at a halfpenny, the Pall Mall Gazette undercutting the older broadsheets on sensational reporting, the Illustrated Police News at a penny with lurid woodcuts on every front page. The Whitechapel case arrived in this market like rain on a parched field. Circulation tripled, quadrupled. The Star alone added more than 300,000 readers between August and November. The papers did not invent the murders. They invented a figure for them. The figure was necessary because the murders, on their own, were unbearable without one. The figure was the man in the tall hat. The figure was the gentleman with the doctor's bag. The figure was the foreigner, the Jew, the lunatic, the surgeon, the Russian agent, the slumming aristocrat who hated women. The figure was, depending on which paper one read in which week, any of these things and several at once. He was always, and this was the consistent feature across every variation, visible. He was someone you would notice if he passed you on the street. He was not, in any account, the ordinary man in the unremarkable coat. The papers could not have given the city such a man. Such a man would not have sold papers. The ripper of the broadsheets was a costume. It would prove durable enough to outlive the case, and the century after. The letters helped. After the Dear Boss letter and the From Hell parcel, the country received approximately 200 further communications signed Jack the Ripper, or some variant, in the months of October and November alone. They came from Bristol and Birmingham and Glasgow. They came from villages in Yorkshire and from a curate in Devon. They came in red ink and in pencil and in what was claimed to be blood and what was almost never blood. Scotland Yard catalogued them. Scotland Yard did not believe most of them. But the papers printed extracts from the most colourful, the ones with the funny little games, the ones with the bragging, the ones with the misspellings that suggested either a working-class hand or a clever forgery of one. Each printed extract added to the figure. Each edition made the figure harder to dislodge. The man with the cold tea read the papers like everyone else. He read about himself. He read descriptions that did not resemble him, and confessions he had not written, and theories that placed him in 3 boroughs at once. He read the speculation that he was a foreign sailor, that he was a Polish butcher, that he was a member of the royal household. This last would not appear in print until decades later, but the seed of it, the suggestion that the killer must be someone protected by power, had begun to circulate in the autumn in the form of anonymous letters to the Pall Mall Gazette. He read all of it. He did not, so far as anyone can know, take pleasure in it. He did not, so far as anyone can know, take anything in it. He folded the paper. He put it down. He drank his tea, fresh, this time, while it was hot. He had begun, in November, to keep it warmer. There is a particular passage in the Star of the 12th of October that captures, better than any other published in the autumn, what the press had become. It described the Ripper, with no source given, as a man whose footstep on a wet pavement would be the last sound a woman ever heard, and who walked, when he was not killing, with the silent precision of an animal trained for one purpose. It was good prose. It was vivid prose. It bore no relationship to evidence. The line about footsteps was reprinted in 4 other papers within a week, and entered the popular imagination, and would still be quoted, in slight variations, in books written 100 years later. The city, which had spent September learning to listen to footsteps as a matter of survival, was now reading about them as a matter of literature. The two listenings had become difficult to separate. Outside, on Commercial Street, the rain that had thinned to mist was thickening again. A constable walked past a window where a man was reading a paper at a table. The constable did not look in. The man, behind the glass, finished the article about his footsteps, and turned the page. The number is 5. It has been 5 for 138 years. The 5 canonical victims of the man the papers called Jack the Ripper, Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, Kelly, appear in every book on the case, in every documentary, in every list compiled by every researcher from the 1890s to the present. The number is not, in any rigorous sense, a finding. It is a decision. The decision was made in 1894, 6 years after the autumn, by Sir Melville Macnaghten, who had not been at Scotland Yard during the murders and who set out, in an internal memorandum, to bring administrative order to a case that had never been formally closed. He drew a line around 5 women. The line has held. Before Polly Nichols there had been others. Emma Smith, beaten and raped on the night of the 3rd of April 1888, in Osborne Street, by a gang of 3 men, who she identified to the doctors at the London hospital before she died of peritonitis. The case was, on its surface, gang violence, and was treated as such by H Division at the time. It would later be added to some lists of Ripper victims and excluded from others, depending on what a given researcher chose to weight. Smith herself, dying, had described 3 attackers, not 1. The case fits no pattern. It is in the lists anyway, in many of them, because the autumn of 1888 has a gravity that pulls women into it. And Martha Tabram, 4 months later, in the early hours of the 7th of August, on the first-floor landing of a building called George Yard Buildings off Whitechapel High Street. 39 stab wounds, made with what the doctor thought was probably a bayonet or a long knife and possibly 2 weapons used in succession. No witnesses. 2 soldiers had been seen with her earlier that evening. One of them was identified, questioned, released. The other was never traced. Tabram is in some Ripper lists and not in others. She is in the histories that argue for an evolving killer who began less practiced. She is out of the histories that argue for the consistent post-mortem mutilation of the canonical 5. Both arguments have their merits. Neither can be proved. After Mary Jane Kelly there would be others as well. Rose Milett, found strangled in Clark's Yard off Poplar High Street on the 20th of December, 1888. The police surgeon thought she had hanged herself by accident on her own collar. The coroner disagreed and recorded willful murder. The case was open and then closed and then open. It is in some lists. Alice Mackenzie, found in Castle Alley on the 17th of July, 1889, with her throat cut and superficial abdominal wounds. Dr. Bagster Phillips, who had examined Annie Chapman, thought she had been killed by a different hand. Robert Anderson, by then in charge, thought she had not. The disagreement was never resolved. She is in some lists. And Francis Coles, found under a railway arch in Swallow Gardens on the 13th of February, 1891, with her throat cut in 3 places. A man named James Sadler was arrested for her killing and was almost charged, and was released for lack of evidence, and was almost charged again, and was finally let go. She was 26. She is in some lists. The autumn, by the time it had collected her, had been over for more than 2 years, and was still collecting. What it means to be in some lists is this. It means that a woman's death, which had its own particular geography and its own particular cause and its own particular reasons that may or may not have anything to do with the man who killed Polly Nichols in Bucks Row, becomes attached, over decades, by accretion, by the slow editorial pressure of 138 years of books, to a story that is not hers. She becomes a possibility in someone else's biography. She becomes a footnote in a chapter that is not about her. The women who actually died in Whitechapel in those years did not die in a list. They died in particular streets, on particular evenings, of particular acts done by particular hands, some of which may have been the same hand and some of which almost certainly were not. The number 5 is convenient. It is also, in a sense the case itself never permitted, a tidying up. This is the difficulty the autumn of 1888 has imposed on every historian who has approached it. To tell the story of Jack the Ripper is to participate in the very tidying up that obscures who actually died, and how, and at whose hand, in a quarter-mile of London in a single 12-month period when violent death was, by any honest accounting, an ordinary feature of the streets. It is to take a system of suffering, which is what Whitechapel was, and to extract from it a narrative of a single man, who may or may not have killed 5 women, and to give him a name that none of the women had any part in choosing. The man in the long coat with the Gladstone bag is, even now, easier to discuss than the question of why 76,000 people lived in a single square mile in conditions where women had to walk alone at 3 in the morning, and what part the rest of the city, which read about them, and bought papers about them, and never did anything about the conditions that made the walking necessary, played in the silence that received them. The man with the cold tea, that evening, was not reading. He had folded the paper away. He had washed at the basin and stood at the window of his room, looking out at the small yard. The rain had stopped. The lamp at the far end of the yard was lit. He stood for a long time. The footsteps that began that night in Whitechapel, in the streets that the Vigilance Committee patrolled, in the alleys the constables walked, in the passage off Dorset Street that led to a small court with a gas lamp at its centre and 6 doors, would, in a few hours, include his. The week before her death, Mary Jane Kelly washed her clothes. She did it at the public laundry on Brick Lane, on a Tuesday, with a woman called Lizzie Albrook who lived in No. 2 Miller's Court and who had known her, by sight at least, since the spring. They had walked back together in the early afternoon, carrying their laundry in baskets, and they had stopped at a shop on Dorset Street for a small loaf and a paper of tea. Lizzie Albrook had asked her how she was, and Mary Jane Kelly had said only that she was tired, and that she wished Joseph would come back, and that she had not been sleeping. Lizzie Albrook had nodded, and they had parted at the entrance to the court. It was the last conversation she would have with her that she would remember in detail. There would be one more, 4 days later, which she would remember less well. On the Wednesday, Mary Jane Kelly went to the Britannia public house on the corner of Dorset Street and drank a pint of stout with 2 women she had known in Cardiff. The Cardiff connection was real. She had lived there briefly in the early 1880s, in a house run by a woman named Mrs. Carthy, who would later tell a reporter that Kelly had been the prettiest girl in the house and the most given to drink. The 2 women in the Britannia had been part of that household. They had not seen her in 5 years. They left at 9. Kelly stayed. She drank one more, alone, and walked home to Miller's Court through a rain that was beginning to thicken into the kind that does not stop. She was singing, the woman in number 2 heard, when she came through the passage. The song was the Irish ballad. It carried, in the wet, the way songs carry in courts that are stone on 3 sides. On the Thursday, she did nothing the neighbors could later piece together. She was seen at no public house. She bought nothing from the shop on the corner. The fire in her grate, Mrs. Prater above her would say, was lit by mid-morning, and she had heard footsteps moving in the room below, heavy footsteps, not Kelly's, for perhaps an hour. A man's footsteps. Whose man? No one knew. She had visitors that day. She had visitors most days. The court was used to it. It was used, also, to not asking. By evening she was alone again. The light from her window, the dim greyness through the muslin, was on until midnight, and then it was off. On the Friday morning, the 8th of November, she went to the Horn of Plenty public house on Crispin Street. She had a glass of beer. She left after a quarter of an hour. She walked back through Dorset Street, and she passed a woman selling violets at the corner. The violets, the woman would later tell the police, were the last she had to sell that week, and Mary Jane Kelly bought one. She pinned it to her dress. The flower seller would remember the pinning particularly, because Kelly's hands had been steady, and because the flower had been small and pale and had not, the woman thought, been quite worth what she had charged for it. She would think of this many times in the years that followed. The man with the cold tea, on that Friday morning, was not in his room. He had risen before dawn and walked the streets of Whitechapel for an hour. He had walked past the Britannia, and past the Horn of Plenty, and past the entrance to Miller's Court, and he had not stopped at any of them. He had walked at the pace of a man taking measurements he did not need to write down. By the time the sun had fully come up he was back in his room with a fresh pot of tea on the stove, and he was sitting at the table with a small leather-bound notebook open in front of him, on a page that had no writing on it yet. He did not write anything that morning. He closed the notebook after a while and put it in the inner pocket of the coat he would wear that evening. The notebook would not be found. Joseph Barnett came to Miller's Court between 7:30 and 8 that evening, as he had done 3 times in the previous week. He stayed for half an hour. They talked. He could not, when questioned at the inquest 5 days later, remember what they had talked about, only that the conversation had been calm and that she had been sober, and that she had asked after his health, and that he had asked after hers, and that they had parted at the door without arguing. He had given her the money he could spare. He had walked back to his lodgings on New Street in the rain. He would not see her again. He would identify her body, by what remained of the ears and the eyes, on the afternoon of the 9th. The footsteps in Miller's Court that night began, as they always began, with the women coming home. Mary and Cox at number 5 came in around 11:45. She heard, from her own room, the sound of Kelly's voice through the muslin, singing. She heard a man's voice too, low, not arguing. She fell asleep around midnight. The singing was still going on. Mrs. Prater above came in around 1 and lay down on her bed without undressing because she had been drinking and was tired and the bed had no sheets. She heard, around 3:30, a voice cry out, a single short cry, the word "Oh, murder." And she paid it no attention, because women's voices cried murder in Whitechapel often enough that one had learned not to rise from bed for it. She would, the next day, at the inquest, have to say this aloud. The Lord Mayor's show began at 11 in the morning. The procession formed in Guildhall Yard at 10:30, and at 11:05 the new Lord Mayor, James Whitehead, climbed into his gilded coach in his robes of office, and the bells of St. Lawrence Jury began to ring. The coach moved out into Cheapside behind a column of liveried trumpeters, and the crowd that had been gathering since dawn, 20,000 people by the most conservative police estimate, perhaps 30,000 by the stars, pressed forward against the barricades, and the procession turned west toward the Strand. The morning was cold and grey. The rain had stopped before sunrise. The streets were wet, and the brass bands had been polishing their instruments under the eaves of Guildhall since 7, and the cloth of the trade banners, mercers, goldsmiths, skinners, vintners, hung heavy in the damp air and would not lift in any wind, because there was no wind. 6 miles to the east, the gas lamp at the centre of Miller's Court was still lit. It had burned all night, as it burned every night, and the man who would extinguish it at sunrise, a lamplighter named Henry Birrell, whose round covered the courts between Dorset Street and Spitalfields, had been late that morning. He had not reached the court until 7:15. He had reached up with his pole and turned the tap, and the flame had gone out, and he had moved on to the next court without looking at the closed door of number 13. The court was quiet. It was a Friday quiet. The window with the muslin tacked over the broken pane was dark. Thomas Bowyer was sent at 11:15. He was an assistant to John McCarthy, who owned the shop on Dorset Street and the houses behind it, and he had been sent to collect rent. Mary Jane Kelly was 29 shillings in arrears. McCarthy had given Bowyer the simplest of instructions: go and ask for it. If she has it, take it. If she has not, tell her she must have something for me by Monday. Bowyer walked the 3 doors from the shop to the passage. He turned into the court. He knocked at the door of number 13. He received no answer. He knocked again, harder. He waited, and then he walked around to the window, and he reached through the broken pane. There was muslin, and behind the muslin a coat had been hung up against the cold, and he pushed the coat aside. What he saw, he could not at first understand. The light in the room was thin and grey, and the bed was against the wall opposite the window, and on the bed was what had once been a woman, and was no longer recognizably one. He stood for some seconds with his hand still on the muslin. He turned. He walked, not quickly, back along the passage to Dorset Street. He went into McCarthy's shop. He said, "Governor, I knocked at the door and could not make anyone answer. I looked through the window and saw a lot of blood." McCarthy left the shop with him. They walked back together. McCarthy looked through the window. McCarthy did not speak for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Go for the police. Don't run. Walk." Bowyer walked. He walked to Commercial Street Police Station, half a mile west, and he asked for the inspector on duty, and he gave his message in a steady voice, and Inspector Walter Beck of H Division returned with him on foot, and by 11:20 the door of Miller's Court was sealed and a constable stood at the entrance to the passage and would not let anyone past. The court filled, as the news travelled, with the women who lived in it. They stood in a small group at the passage entrance. They did not speak. Mary and Cox came down from number 5 and stood with them. Elizabeth Prater came down from number 20 and stood with them. Lizzie Albrook came out of number 2 and stood with them. None of them asked what had happened. They knew what had happened. They had been listening for it, in some form, since August. And in the West End, at the corner of Ludgate Hill and Fleet Street, the Lord Mayor's coach was passing the offices of the Daily Telegraph at exactly that moment. The crowd was cheering. A reporter standing on the steps of the Telegraph would later remember that a runner from the agency had come out, just then, and handed his editor a slip of paper, and the editor had read it, and had taken off his hat for a moment, and then put it back on. The runner had been sent because something had come over the telegraph wire from a constable at Commercial Street Station. The editor of the Telegraph would not yet print it. He would let the procession finish. The Lord Mayor passed beneath his window in his gilded coach. The bands played. The crowd cheered. 6 miles east, in a small court off Dorset Street, the door of number 13 had not yet been opened, because the police were waiting, on Sir Charles Warren's standing order, for the bloodhounds that had been promised in October and that would not, in the event, arrive at all. The man with the cold tea, that morning, was on a train. He had risen before light. He had taken what he needed from his room and packed it into a small bag. He had walked to Liverpool Street Station. He had bought a ticket for somewhere the historians have never agreed on, and he had boarded a train that left at 6:43, and he had sat by a window as the train moved north out of London through Hackney and Tottenham and into the fields of Essex, and he had watched the morning come up over a country that had not yet read the papers. The footsteps that had walked Miller's Court that night were no longer in Whitechapel. They were not anywhere. They had become, in the space of a single train journey, what they would remain: unfindable. The door was forced at 1:30 in the afternoon. It was McCarthy who forced it, with a pickaxe, on the order of Superintendent Arnold, who had arrived from H Division headquarters at 12:30 and who had decided, after 2 hours of waiting for bloodhounds that were never going to come, that the protocol could be set aside. The pickaxe went through the panel of the door in a single blow. The wood, soft from years of damp, splintered easily. McCarthy reached through, found the latch on the inside, and the door swung open into the room. The smell came out first. It moved past the men standing in the court the way smoke moves out of a chimney that has not been swept. The constable at the entrance to the passage turned his face away. The women who had been standing at the passage entrance since 11 did not turn away. They had not turned away in 5 hours, and they did not turn away now. What was in the room is the part that the histories describe and the canal will not. It is not a refusal of detail. It is a refusal of the particular kind of looking that the autumn of 1888 has taught the city to do, the looking that turned Polly Nichols's post-mortem into front-page copy, that turned Annie Chapman's organs into a printed list, that turned the half-kidney sent to George Lusk into a national entertainment. Mary Jane Kelly had been 25 years old. She had a room with a door of her own, and a window with a muslin patch over a broken pane, and a song she sang when she came home drunk, and a violet pinned to her dress on the last day she was seen alive. She had been killed. That is what the canal will say. The rest was carried, that afternoon and for 138 years afterwards, by people who were not her. Dr. Thomas Bond arrived at 1:45. He had been requested specifically by Robert Anderson, who had asked him, in October, to review all the murders and produce a single forensic profile of the killer. Bond was a senior surgeon at Westminster Hospital. He had read every file. He had not, until that afternoon, seen the work himself. He stood in the doorway of number 13 for perhaps a minute before he stepped inside. He would write his report that evening. He would write that the killer had no medical training. He would write that the killer was likely a quiet, unremarkable man, not noticeably strange to his neighbors, possibly in his own room within easy walking distance of Whitechapel. He would write that the killer was not, in the medical sense, insane, and that there would be no further killings of this kind, because the killer had reached, in this room, the limit of what he had been moving toward. Bond was correct on every point. He was the only investigator of the autumn who would prove to be. The room was photographed. The photograph would survive. 3 plates taken from different angles, the first crime scene photographs in the history of the Metropolitan Police. The plates would be filed at Scotland Yard, and copied again, and eventually published, and eventually reproduced in every book on the case until the photograph itself became a piece of furniture in the autumn's afterlife. The room was emptied by evening. The body was removed at 6 in a parish coffin. The blood was cleaned from the floorboards by McCarthy's own staff in the days that followed, with sand and lye, and the room was let again before Christmas to a different woman, who would live in it for 14 months and never speak of what had happened in it before her time. In the passage, the gas lamp at the centre of the court was lit at 4. It was lit by a different lamplighter. Birrell's round had ended at noon, and the afternoon round belonged to another man, whose name has not survived. He reached up with his pole and turned the tap, and the flame caught, and the small wet court was, for the first time that day, illuminated against the early dusk of November. The lamp threw its yellow circle on the cobbles, and on the splintered panel of the door of number 13, and on the boots of the constable standing at the entrance to the passage, and on the muslin patch over the broken pane, which was, by now, a piece of evidence and would be removed before midnight. The light did what the light always did in Miller's Court. It reached the edges of the court and did not go further. The passage to Dorset Street remained dark. And the footsteps in Miller's Court that afternoon were the footsteps of the men who had come for the body, and the woman who had come to wash the room, and the photographer with his tripod, and the inspector with his notebook, and the constable with his measured pace at the entrance to the passage. They were not the footsteps the court had spent the autumn learning to hear. Those footsteps had left the court at some hour the witnesses could not agree on, perhaps 3:30, perhaps 4, perhaps later, and had moved through the passage and out into Dorset Street and west toward Commercial Street, and had passed a constable on his beat without being looked at, and had reached, eventually, a station, and a train, and a country that did not know yet what had been done. They were no longer audible in Whitechapel. They had never, in any useful sense, been audible there. The listening that the city had built over 3 months to catch them, the patrols, the whistles, the women in pairs, the lamps left burning, the small lights kept on in doorways at 3 in the morning, had not caught them. The listening had outlasted the cause. The cause had walked out through it. In the room, by 6 o'clock, the floor had been swept and the bed had been stripped, and Mary Jane Kelly was gone, in the parish coffin, to the mortuary on Shoreditch High Street. The court was quiet. The women had gone back into their rooms. The constable at the passage entrance had been relieved by another constable, and the second constable, walking the perimeter of the court at 6:30, heard nothing, not a voice, not a cry, not a footstep, and stood for a moment beneath the gas lamp and listened, the way the city had taught everyone in it to listen, and found, for the first time in 3 months, that there was nothing left to hear. The killings stopped. That is the simplest sentence in the autumn, and it is the one the autumn most resists. There were further deaths in Whitechapel, Rose Milett in December, Alice Mackenzie in July of the following year, Francis Coles in February of 1891, but the wave of mutilations that had begun with Polly Nichols and ended with Mary Jane Kelly did not continue. The killer who had moved through Whitechapel for those 3 months had, after the 9th of November, gone somewhere the city could not reach. He had stopped, or he had died, or he had been confined, in an asylum or a prison or a workhouse, under another charge. Or he had crossed the Channel, or the Atlantic, or simply moved across London into a borough the case had never touched. Bond, in his report, had been right that the killings of this kind would end. He had not been right because he had named the man. He had been right because the man had been ready to stop. The investigation continued for 3 more years. Swanson kept the file open. Aberline interviewed, by his own retrospective count, more than 1,000 additional people between November of 1888 and the spring of 1891. Anderson, in October of 1889, told a Home Office committee that he believed the killer had been identified, and that the identification could not be made public because the only witness who could swear to it, a Jewish witness, had refused to give evidence against a fellow Jew in a court that would have hanged him. Anderson would repeat this claim, in his memoirs, in 1910. Swanson would, in pencil, in the margin of his copy, write the name. The name was Kosminski. Whether Anderson was correct, whether the witness existed, whether the refusal had been recorded anywhere, whether the identification had ever been made at all, is one of the questions that has not been settled, and will not be settled, because the principals are dead and the records have been thinned by time. Sir Charles Warren resigned. The resignation had been pending since October, and the events of the 9th of November had not, technically, hastened it. The official cause was a disagreement with the Home Secretary over an article Warren had published, without permission, in Murray's magazine. The unofficial cause was the failure to find the killer. James Monroe replaced him. Monroe lasted 20 months. He was replaced by Edward Bradford. The commissioners of police, in the years that followed the autumn, would change more often than the assistant commissioners beneath them, and the assistant commissioners would change more often than the inspectors in the divisions, and the inspectors would change more often than the constables walking the beats. The constables, who had been the men closest to the case, were also the men least listened to in the inquiries that followed. One of them, John Neal, the constable who had found Polly Nichols's body at 3:45 on the 31st of August, would walk Bucks Row every working night for the next 11 years, and would, in 1899, be promoted out of H Division to Bow, and would never afterwards walk that street again, except once, in 1913, on his way to a funeral. Joseph Barnett gave his inquest testimony and was released. He returned to lodgings on New Street. He lived another 47 years. He never spoke of Mary Jane Kelly in public again after the inquest. He worked as a fish market porter at Billingsgate until he was too old, and he kept rooms in Shadwell, and he died in 1926 in a house off Cable Street, and was buried in an unmarked grave at the City of London Cemetery, the same cemetery where Polly Nichols had been buried 38 years earlier in a pauper's plot 11 rows away. Whether he visited her grave, in those 47 years, the cemetery records cannot say. The cemetery records say only that he was buried in a section that was, by 1926, almost full. The witnesses scattered. Mary Ann Cox left Whitechapel and was never traced. Elizabeth Prater married a docker and moved to Bermondsey. Lizzie Albrook went into service in Hampstead and was, by the 1890s, working in a house she would not name in the only newspaper interview she ever gave. George Hutchinson, a labourer who had given a long and detailed inquest statement describing a man he had seen with Kelly at 2 in the morning on the 9th of November, disappeared from the public record entirely within a year, and was, by some researchers, presumed dead and, by others, presumed to have given a name that was not his own at the inquest. The witnesses were the part of the case that the case did not preserve. They had been the eyes the autumn depended on. The autumn had not, in the end, been able to keep them. The man with the cold tea is, in this part of the story, no longer named even in metaphor. He is, by the spring of 1889, a man who has not appeared in this script for some weeks, and who never will appear again, because the omniscient that has followed him through the autumn cannot follow him beyond it. He had stepped out of Whitechapel onto a train, and the train had moved into a country, and the country had moved into a century, and the century had moved into another one, and somewhere in the long onward movement of all of it he had simply ceased to be findable. He had lived a life, or he had not. He had died early, or he had died old. He had told someone, or he had told no one. The omniscient had been the wrong instrument for finding him, and had known it from the start, and had followed him anyway, the way one follows weather across a continent, not because the following will catch the weather, but because the following is the form of attention the weather deserves. What survived was the name. Jack the Ripper outlived the man who may or may not have done what was done in his name. He outlived the witnesses. He outlived the investigators. He outlived the streets. Dorset Street was demolished in the 1920s, and Miller's Court with it, and the site is now a service yard behind a multi-story car park. He outlived the century in which he had been invented by a sub-editor on the Strand, and the century after, and he is alive in the one we are speaking from now, because the name was, from the beginning, the thing the case was for. The name was easier than the women. The name was easier than the streets. The name is easier, still, than the question of why those streets existed in the form they did, and what part the rest of the city, which produced the name, and bought the papers, and read the inquests, and walked away, played in their existence. The name will outlive this telling too. 138 years have passed. The streets are not the same streets. Dorset Street is gone. Miller's Court is gone. Bucks Row was renamed Durward Street in 1892 by residents who had grown tired of the omnibuses slowing as they passed, and of the men in tall hats stepping down at the corner to look. Hanbury Street is still called Hanbury Street, but number 29 was demolished in 1970, and the yard where Annie Chapman died is now under the foundations of a brewery extension that was, itself, closed in 2005. The London the autumn happened in has been worn down to almost nothing. What remains of it is, mostly, the names. The case has not been solved. It will not be solved. Every few years, a book or a documentary or a DNA analysis of a stained shore will announce that the killer has, at last, been identified, and within months the announcement will be contested, and within a year it will be quietly retracted, and within 5 years it will be remembered only by the small community of researchers who track such announcements the way amateur astronomers track comets. There have been more than 100 named suspects. There will be more. None of them, in the rigorous sense, will be the man. The case is not the kind of case that produces a man at the end. It produces, instead, a kind of attention. An attention that has, over 138 years, learned to live without resolution. That is the inheritance the autumn left. The women have been, in the last 20 years, recovered. Not all of them. Not in any final way. But the books that began to appear in the 1990s, and accelerated in the 2000s, and reached a kind of culmination in the work of Hallie Rubenhold in 2019, have done something the autumn itself never permitted. They have moved the 5 women, and the others, out of the killer's biography and back into their own. Polly Nichols was a woman with a bonnet she had bought that afternoon. Annie Chapman was a woman selling crochet work and matchboxes for the price of a bed. Elizabeth Stride was a woman who had invented a grief she could be seen carrying. Catherine Eddowes was a woman who had asked, on a Bishopsgate station floor, what kind of hiding she would get when she got home. Mary Jane Kelly was a woman of 25 who had pinned a violet to her dress and sung a song her neighbors knew by heart. They were not 5 units of a body of evidence. They were 5 women. The autumn, and the century that followed, had not been able to say this. The century we are speaking from has begun to. And Whitechapel itself, the place, carried something the records cannot quite locate. It carried a habit of listening. The women who walked Dorset Street in the years after Miller's Court walked it differently from the women who had walked it before Bucks Row. The mothers who lived above the pubs on Commercial Road taught their daughters, without ever quite naming the teaching, to listen for the wrong kind of step. The pattern of small lights kept burning in doorways at 3 in the morning did not, after the autumn ended, return to what it had been. The patrols stopped. The Vigilance Committee disbanded by 1890. But the habit of listening, the involuntary counting, the half-second pause before the corner, the hand on the latch held a moment longer than reason required, became, in the East End, an inheritance. It was passed to women who had not been born when Polly Nichols died. It was passed to women whose grandmothers had not been born when Polly Nichols died. It is, in some forms, still being passed. The autumn did not invent it. The autumn made it permanent. This is what Whitechapel carried. Not the name, not the legend, not the figure in the long coat with the Gladstone bag. A way of hearing, a way of being awake at 3 in the morning, a way of standing at one's own door, with one's hand on the latch, listening for a moment longer than is reasonable, before going in. The man with the cold tea, wherever he went, took his own footsteps with him. The city kept the listening. If you have walked with us through these 20 parts, through Bucks Row in August, through Hanbury Street and the double event in September, through the wet sponge on Goulston Street and the silence of October, through the morning of the Lord Mayor's show and the room in Miller's Court, thank you. This kind of telling depends on the kind of listening you have been doing. The archive does not move at the pace of news. It moves at the pace it moves. And when it asks for 40 minutes, or 50, or however long this story has been for you, it is asking for an attention that the rest of the day will not return. If you have given it, it has not been spent. It has been added to something. If you would like the next archive to find you when it is ready, the small things help, a subscription, a comment, a moment to say where you were listening from. And if there is a story you would like the archive to walk through next, leave it. The archives we walk through next are, in part, the ones you ask for. The streets of Whitechapel are quiet, in the form they exist in now. There is a brewery extension where Annie Chapman's yard had been. There is a service yard behind a multi-story car park where Mary Jane Kelly's room had been. There is a small plaque on a wall on Durward Street that some of the tourists who come looking for Bucks Row no longer recognize without help. The names of the women appear, in some places, on the plaques, and in some places they do not. The footsteps that walk those streets now are the footsteps of people who have not been afraid the way the women of 1888 were afraid. The listening that was passed down has thinned. It is, in some streets, gone entirely. But on a Friday in November, when the rain has stopped and the gas lamps, the few that remain as gas, are hissing in the wet, a woman walking home along what used to be Dorset Street can still, sometimes, hear something she does not have a name for, and stand at her door with her hand on the latch a moment longer than is reasonable, before going in. The autumn taught her to do this. She does not know that it did. History told with space to breathe. Thank you for staying in the archive. We will see you in the next one.